our first instinct, given our survival bias or negativity bias, is we're constantly hypervigilant, scanning for distress. And when we find it, it triggers our mirror neurons and our mirror reaction. Like, in other words, you're anxious, I'm anxious. You're angry,
Yeah.
I'm angry. First,
Yeah.
and it's a survival reflex. Like
Hmm.
if your fellow deer is getting a little fidgety, there might be a lion over there.
Yeah.
So you want to stop and think about, like, why is my fellow deer getting fidgety? You're just going to get anxious, and you're going
Yeah.
to get ready to run, just like your fellow deer is getting ready to run. So,
Yeah.
unfortunately, that means that unless we do something, we're wired to live in fear and totally all caught up in other people's distress in
Mm.
such a way that it's constantly stirring up our own distress.
Yeah.
Right. So this is why, like, somebody, Jean-Paul Sartre might have said, hell is other people.
Right. A little
But
glib, but I know what you mean.
from a Buddhist point of view, yes, hell is other people. Heaven is also other people.
Okay. Hey, everyone, and welcome to the Integral Wellbeing Podcast, where we explore the true causes of well-being from an integral perspective. I'm your host, Timo Peters, and today my guest is Dr. Joe Loizzo, a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and Buddhist scholar and teacher. Dr. Joe is the author of Sustainable Happiness, Advances in Contemplative Psychotherapy, and Boundless Leadership, and is also the founder and academic director of the Nalanda Institute in New York, where he combines contemplative wisdom with psychological insight, meditation with neuroscience, and the spirit of care with the pursuit of a just world. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you so much, Timo, for inviting me. Happy to be on your podcast. It's a great
Great.
idea. Integral well-being,
Yeah,
something we all need.
exactly. And the first episode, so it's off to a good start.
Oh, wonderful.
Uh, yeah.
Honored.
So I thought it might be fun for the listeners just to hear how we actually met. I was a student for about 2 years in your contemplative psychotherapy program, and I think we have two mutual teachers, Bob Thurman and Dr. Nida Chinaksang.
Mm-hmm.
I've thoroughly enjoyed Bob's wonderful. There's lots of videos of him on YouTube where he gives very fun lectures and such. So it's always been a joy to encounter him. Yeah, and of course Dr. Nida. Yeah. So there's so much I would love to talk to you about. It was almost impossible to sort of squeeze it into an hour, but because we only have so long, I would love to focus the conversation very much on the content of your work, especially as you laid it out in your book, Sustainable Happiness, which I have finally managed to get through. It's not an easy read, quite a doorstopper, as we say in Dutch, and but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that would be good, I think. So, but before we do that, maybe just a very quick a bio. You're a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and Buddhist scholar. I was wondering what was actually the original motivation for you to dedicate your life to these pursuits?
Well, yeah, thank you, Timo. And yes, it's been a real pleasure having you in our contemplative psychotherapy program and sharing the Dharma with you. I know you have a very strong interest in it and also in applying it, which, in the real world, which is something that has always been part of my uh, excitement about the Dharma. So yeah,
Right.
I started out, uh, sort of in an Italian Catholic family where my dad was becoming a physician and a psychiatrist and sort of moving more and more into the world of modern science, sort of leaving behind the Catholic culture that he was educated and raised in. My mom was becoming a history teacher, social studies teacher, and uh,
Mm.
and remained much more sort of connected to her roots, you might say, and both literally and figuratively, because she loved to garden.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
And so I like to say that this was my original double-blind experiment because over the years, I saw him sort of burn out from the
Ah,
stress. He
right.
loved being a physician. I think, really was a great psychotherapist from what I hear from his clients. I mean, you could see it in the way he had an office in the home, so they would come and go.
Mm,
A lot of grateful folks, and certainly I heard it, at his funeral, sadly. Um,
mm,
but my mom, on the other hand, seemed to get better and better with age instead. So I figured,
right.
what's
Interesting.
going
Yeah.
on
What's going on
here?
there? Exactly. Yeah.
And it certainly seemed to me to have something to do with the connection to a spiritual culture, a vibrant spiritual culture that he kind of gave up.
Right. Right.
Part of his wish to kind of be modern, assimilate, and um, and so I
Mm,
made that commitment early on in high school. I was interested in reading a lot of the books on his shelf, and of course, the folks that most appealed to me, people like Jung and Viktor Frankl and so on, were more in an existential, psychoanalytic orientation,
right.
and quite like shared with me this sense of whether it's nostalgia or longing, or the sense that somehow the soul was missing or the spirit was missing in modern scientific culture.
Mm,
Uh,
hmm.
and then, and I was at a very excellent, actually Catholic boys' high school, and my first really kind of spiritual mentor was the president of the school, who was very interested in existentialism. We read
Oh, wow.
Rollo and Viktor Frankl and others, and I had some serious, uh, both kind of philosophical conversations with him,
Mm,
about existentialism and like why theism,
right. Right.
what and he was able to sort of roll with the punches, um, and also had really good education there in terms of uh, colonialism and the
Mm,
impact it was around the globe. So there was also a
yeah.
history and social justice dimension. Um, and then I went
Yeah.
to college, and in my first religion class, there was Bob. Right,
Right.
he had just, I guess was maybe a few years out, maybe more than a few years. He'd left the his robes,
Right.
uh, and went to graduate school, and he was just finished with graduate school. So this was his first gig and his first semester teaching.
Yeah. And was that at Columbia University or
No, that was at Amherst College where
Amherst?
he worked
Okay.
before
Yeah.
Columbia.
Right.
And it was so I remember the room and the experience of that first class very clearly. There was
Mm,
two professors, two religion professors. One was this sort of waspy, you know, duck hunting professor of African religion and Middle Eastern religion,
right.
and the other end of the table was Bob, who had, with all his wild hair and his glass
Yeah.
eye and
Yeah.
flowery ties. And of course, he didn't really start talking about. So I don't remember a single word that John Pemberton said.
Wow.
To be frank with
Mm,
you, but I
yeah.
remember just everything that we read vis-a-vis the Dharma, and
Yeah.
specifically, interestingly enough, Bob didn't start us off in Theravada Buddhism or even in
Mm,
Mahayana. He started us off in the Tantras.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so we dove right into Yamantaka and Vajrayogini, and we were reading Milarepa and
Wow.
Lamagavita.
Yeah.
So it was kind of really very karmic in the sense that kind of that's in terms of my interest in Jung, with the archetypes and the alchemy and all of this sort of, you know, magical stuff. It
Mm,
was like, okay, well, here it is.
right.
And my feeling about Jung was, okay, wow, there was the mother lode, but it was in Greek and Latin and in some
Mm,
sort of mostly, dead library somewhere in Switzerland.
right.
Um, and so how was I going to really get access to those traditions? They were no longer living, and I wasn't a classicist,
Mm.
Uh, so to meet somebody who was part of a community where these traditions were very much alive, and in
Yeah.
some sense maybe even richer, more fully developed, more completely fleshed out,
Mm.
it's like, wow, okay, so I can go over here and go
Right.
deep with and of course also Buddhism had, the has that very unique relationship with science and versus spirituality that
Hmm.
is kind of a bridging or a middle way,
Hmm.
whereas everything else that I was used to was one or the other. You know what I mean? It was
Right.
like disembodied, objectified, uh, calculating science, mechanistic science, or religion without, a real willingness to examine or dialogue. Although, again, like I do think that there still was some life and vitality to both traditions,
Right.
but
Right.
they weren't talking to each other. They were fighting with each other,
Mm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the beauty of Buddhist culture, is that there was a real integrity. Talk about integral wholeness, right? There was a
Mm.
real sense that this was one culture,
Mm.
and which science had a role, but it wasn't objectified science. It was more experiential and phenomenological, right?
Hmm. Also, the first person perspective, very much.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the lived experience. And of course, spirituality had a role, but it wasn't all about ritual and myth. It was about, finding our own human spirit. And so it just
Mm.
really clicked, right? That this was a
Yeah.
kind of middle way I was looking for.
Yeah.
And that was that.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. So it was really kind of Bob who kindled your interest in particular in sort of the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, because I guess probably most people who are somewhat familiar with Buddhism, who've heard maybe they're practicing mindfulness, they're more familiar with the Theravada or sort of Zen approaches, which tend to be uh, sort of very much focused on the mind. And then you see this whole Tibetan thing with the wild iconography and the yoga poses, and it seems to be a different animal. But I
It
guess,
sure does.
yeah,
It sure does. And, for me, of course, it worked because I was coming from this Catholic background.
right.
And I was always interested in the arts. I was interested in poetry and Renaissance, painting, European painting,
Oh yeah.
been into and out of many churches so for me, it was familiar. The
Mm.
ritual, the richness, the symbolic richness didn't put me off. I
Yeah.
wasn't, in fact, again, because I really wasn't looking for something so cool as,
Hmm.
like stereotypically you might think of, Theravada or Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
I wanted something that was also more vibrant. And the other thing too about my past, that my own particular karma that resonated vis-a-vis the tantras was we were very much a lay Catholic family. Like
Hmm.
you know, my father did a lot of work with seminarians and with, the larger community, but
Mm.
we were not so thrilled about the monastic flavor of Catholicism.
Right.
And so, in that sense, Tantric Buddhism is, as much as Dr. Nito often teaches, is really very well suited to people living a lay life. It's
Yeah.
embodied. It's you know has aspects of, it's richly complex and symbolic. It has passion. It has,
Yeah.
so in that sense, um, you know it just uh, resonated, very much with what was familiar, the kind of form of spirituality that I was most familiar with. So
Right. Right. And I guess one of the things that you write a lot about in the book, especially the first part on mindfulness, you kind of say that in the Nalanda tradition, which is just another term for this Indo-Tibetan current, which was preserved by Nalanda University, which I guess was one of the first or the first university in the world, actually, in history, where sort of these Buddhist sciences sort of reached their peak. That you see there a sort of more complex, maybe somewhat deeper approach to mindfulness, which includes more analytic insight and things like that. I was wondering if you could say something about that, sort of comparing it to the modern form.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of, uh, the kind of Buddhist, the kind of Theravada and Zen Buddhism that influenced the West were both monastically based traditions.
Right.
What that means is that they were for professional contemplatives, people who were just going to go in and commit their life, and however many, maybe their whole life or some significant part of their life, and just osmose the tradition. So how does learning happen in those kinds of contemplative based traditions? It does happen by osmosis. People read the scriptures by chanting them together. Learn to meditate by meditating together. They have ethics because they got the rules, the pratimoksha rules. So there's a lot of scaffolding that feeds those monastic traditions in a way that is suitable for someone who's a professional contemplative, because eventually you're gonna learn it. If you spend the rest of your life, you're gonna hear it all, you're gonna know it all, Now, what happens if you move toward a lay-based form of contemplative learning? So the university system, as opposed to the vihara system, the viharas, the monasteries,
right?
But the mahaviharas, which you translate as university, the great or big monasteries,
right?
Like our Western universities, grew out of the monastic orders,
right? Like in Paris and so on. Yeah.
But they very quickly geared themselves toward teaching large numbers of people. So Nalanda, in fact, Nalanda University was the world's first residential university, along with Takshashila in Afghanistan,
right,
and Danyakataka in Andhra Pradesh, and eventually Nalanda had a few other sister monasteries that were similarly geared toward higher learning, right? So people get there they go to the ordinary monastery, sort of like grammar school, and then they go to Nalanda as sort of like the university.
Oh, right.
There were 100 classes a day, 15,000 people. You don't teach 15,000 people the same way who might be from Japan, and like there were 13 different colleges from around Asia. You don't teach them the same way you teach the monk down the corner who's going to live there forever. And so that in that sense, the Nalanda tradition was much more focused on a higher kind of critical thinking, critical learning, interfacing Buddhist contemplative culture with secular sciences like medicine, metallurgy, architecture.
They're very much part of the curriculum, if I'm not mistaken, right? They taught the 5 sciences. The 5th one would be the inner science of Buddhism and other traditions, but then you also had medicine, as you say, and
public policy, social theory, economics. These were all part of, like again, what we now like. This was all happening from the 3rd century, sort of,
right?
Whereas in the West, a similar movement toward the universities didn't happen for another 800 or 1,000 years.
Right.
So that's part of the difference, is that when you study the Nalanda tradition, with certain exceptions, and I'll come back to that, go into this university level culture where critical thinking is right front and center. Thinking, critical, dialogue about ethics. It's not just follow the rules. It's like, what is really ethics? What do we need to do to make a better world? It's much more kind of complex and And of course, even meditation is not, it's not just mindfulness, it's mindfulness, it's
Mm.
shamatha, it's vipassana, it's tantric meditation, it's,
Yeah.
so, so yeah, I think that, the exceptions in the Tibetan tradition are the early schools, the Nyingma, and to some
Mm.
extent the Kagyu, more so than Nyingma, which really offered a kind of simplified forms of the curriculum
Mm.
because there
Yeah.
really wasn't, there were not the monastic institutions in the day. They had to teach lay people and they had to make it simple,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Zen happened in a similar way in China.
Mm. Right. Right. And I guess one of the sort of positive aspects of the simplification, which you also see happening at Nalanda, was, for example, people like Atisha, one of the abbots, creating the 7-point mind training, which is one of the cornerstones of your approach to teaching this tradition, where you have a set of aphorisms that relatively easily be memorized, sort of laying out a complete sort of set of flashcards for how to practice in day-to-day world. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what made you choose that particular template for teaching modern Westerners. What's so useful about that?
Well, again, because I think, Atisha, he has a great story where um, Tara, challenged him like, you think you're so compassionate. He was going around the uh, the stupa in Bodh Gaya. You think you're so compassionate. You don't know anything about compassion. You've got to go speak to this person, and that was Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa, namely his name was Dharmakirti of Indonesia, right?
Mm.
And to go all the way to Indonesia to study, but like Dharmakirti, that not the regular Dharmakirti that we think of
Mm.
as related to Buddhist science, but um, this compassion wala, this compassion focused. He was busy teaching a lay populace that wasn't a lot of them were not literate,
Mm.
and so part of Atisha's mission was to learn how to practice compassion and renew or revive the art, the Shantideva and Chandrakirti that had been cultivated over the course of whatever 7 centuries or 8 centuries in the Nalanda tradition,
Mm. Yeah.
um, but to formulate it in a way that you could teach it to lay people. And because another thing that Tara said to him is, well, you could, you could do an awful lot living and teaching in India. If you go to Tibet, your life is going to be shortened, but you're going to have, incredibly more impact and benefit.
Mm.
So at some point, he put together this wish to sort of revive the compassion teachings with the wish to go to Tibet and preserve the teachings in Tibet, probably with some awareness that Buddhism in India was dying out, for a whole
Mm.
range of complicated reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, as we're in the same boat, right? We're trying to take this very rich tradition, it's a very complex academic tradition, and practical tradition, and bring it into a culture to which it's foreign, where there are no institutions really to support it, to speak of, very
Right.
few.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to focus on, what is the sort of traveling light? What's the essence?
Yeah.
What's the practical essence where people can get benefit? And then you have a community, you build a community that eventually is going to be able to support the whole tradition, the richness, including the academic, dimensions of it.
Yeah. 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 And so I guess one of the main practices that is taught in the 7-point mind training is one that's probably familiar to quite a few people, the practice of Tonglen, or giving and taking, which is this, this visualization essentially coupled with the breath that essentially you could do anywhere, anytime. Like that's the wonderful thing about it. You can literally be sitting in the bus looking at somebody and just, breathing out happiness to them and maybe sort of breathing in their suffering with the wish to alleviate it. And I guess what's really unique about your approach, to me, when I read your book, is that you actually couple this to what do we know sort of neuroscientifically, neuropsychologically, what's actually happening at the nervous system level? Why is this so powerful to shift us out of a kind of stress reactive state into one that is sort of safe and connected and, yeah, pro-social, I guess. So I was wondering if you could say something about what's actually happening at the sort of nervous system level when we do a practice like that.
It's a fascinating. In fact, I was just teaching a group of nurses the other day. you know, uh, how to do this kind of practice for burnout prevention, care.
Mm,
So we know actually through a series of, of course, the last 30 or 40 years have been hugely exciting in terms of neuroscience because we have much more awareness of the many ways the different levels of the psyche relate to the nervous system.
mm,
And then specifically, given His Holiness's involvement in guiding some of the research surrounding meditation, there's been, at least at this point, 10 or maybe more, actually, we might even say up to 15 years of research on the mechanisms of compassion training.
right.
And so, to me, I think how I often teach this is, of course, that, it has to do with stress and coping with social stress. So, stress, as I usually teach, it doesn't just live. We hear about fight, flight, pain, freeze. We think about the autonomic nervous system, the
Yeah.
brainstem, right? The reptilian brain, blah, blah, blah. But of course, stress doesn't just live in the oldest part of the brain or in the autonomic nervous system. It exists at all levels of the nervous system. In particular,
Mm-hmm.
at all levels of the nervous system, there are networks that are there for self-protective reasons, for the conservative networks that are self-enclosing typically, that focus on, okay, I need to be very vigilant and careful. I need to look out for myself and in different ways, whether that's cognitively worrying or it's emotionally being in fear and maybe hurt or longing or whatever. And then at the level of the autonomic or visceral nervous system, being reactive, being ready to flight, faint, or freeze at the moment, at a moment's notice. So compassion training operates mainly in the middle there on the limbic system or the emotional brain.
Right.
And in the emotional brain, as in all these other areas of the brain, as I like to teach it, there isn't just one network, which is self-enclosing. There's another network, which is prosocial, right? So the network or the capacity that's prosocial at the limbic level, when we feel safely connected, we relate to others in a mood and with the intentionality and experience of care. And so some people call it the care system. Some people call it the empathy system. It's there, okay? But on the other hand, so is the salience network, which is anchored in the amygdala, and this is there as a kind of early warning self-protective system to scan the body language, facial expressions, vocal tone of the animals around us. And so our first instinct, given our survival bias or negativity bias, is we're constantly hypervigilant, scanning for distress. And when we find it, it triggers our mirror neurons and our mirror reaction. Like, in other words, you're anxious, I'm anxious. You're angry, I'm angry. And it's a survival reflex. Like if your fellow deer is getting a little fidgety, there might be a lion over there. So you want to stop and think about, like, why is my fellow deer getting fidgety? You're just going to get anxious, and you're going to get ready to run, just like your fellow deer is getting ready to run. So, unfortunately, that means that unless we do something. We're wired to live in fear and totally all caught up in other people's distress in
Mm.
such a way that it's constantly stirring up our own distress,
Yeah.
right? So this is why, like somebody, Jean-Paul Sartre might have said, "Hell is other people."
Right. A little
But
glib, but I know what you mean.
from a Buddhist point of view, yes, hell is other people. Heaven is also other people,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so, really, actually, hell is really a way of being connected that's based in fear and isolation and self-enclosure. Heaven is a way of being connected that's based in compassion and security, confidence, care. So
Mm.
what we found in this in meditation research is that compassion training, very as little as 6 sessions, 5 or 6 sessions of compassion training, and for a group of undergraduates, um, is enough to transform the way they're processing, viewing the stressed faces of people who are suffering.
Right.
Um, to transform it from the subliminal, what I call um, sympathetic distress, like or some
Mm.
people call social contagion,
Mm.
you know, the sort of unconscious subliminal, you're anxious, I'm anxious,
Yeah.
into well, you're anxious. I know what that feels like, but I'm okay. And how can I help? Right.
Hmm.
And that simple shift of being mindful of our feelings as and rather than kind of reifying them or getting co-opted or hijacked by them, recognizing that they're about sympathy for someone else or empathy for someone else,
Mm.
that allows us to engage this higher care system, which calms our fears, and actually enables the elements of the empathy network, including the anterior cingulate, the
Mm.
nimbus cumbens, you know, the medial prefrontal cortex, and so on. All of these parts of the system, and even actually the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in some studies. These are all, you know, I you know I feel distress, but it's not mine. It's yours. I'm feeling, and I
Yeah.
don't, and I'm not threatened. I'm safe because I'm connected to you and care.
Mm.
What can I do to help? And
Right.
that actually, instead of stimulating burnout, right, or compassion fatigue or vicarious
Yeah.
trauma, social contagion, it stimulates the internal reward system
Right.
and what we call compassion satisfaction, that deep sense of the meaningful. This is the kind of satisfaction that positive psychology has found leads
Mm.
to longevity, well-being, healthy immunity, and healing, and all the other things. So,
Right.
so this practice, probably more than any other, I think, is probably the single most important um, first aid that we
Mm.
need to be living in the crazy, dysfunctional
Yeah.
world we live in. And that's why, I included it as, central. I
Yeah.
think 7 point mind training is a beautiful, there are similar things in the Catholic tradition, actually, like the St.
Mm.
Francis prayer and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. But the uh, 7 point mind training, is more rigorous and deeper, both philosophically or
Mm.
cognitively, in terms of the cognitive dimension of compassion,
Yeah.
and in terms of the emotional uh, cues or guidance or
Yeah.
pointers that we need to be really resilient in compassion training.
Right. Right. Yeah. I remember it was a huge eye opener for me when I was doing the cultivating emotional balance teacher training. It was developed by Paul Ekman and Alan Wallace. There, they also mentioned these similar studies with people like Mathieu Ricard, the monk who spent many years in retreat practicing these sort of things, and just seeing how if he would just be experiencing the suffering of another person, the pain centers are activating, it's distressing, But the moment he activates the compassion, which is sort of the wish to alleviate that, immediately you see, as you said, you see the pleasure centers activate, and there's this activation, and it's actually calming, strangely enough, to the system. Which, yeah, I think, as you said, it's something that we all need in a world where so much is going on all the time. I mean, if you watch the news at all, you're just overwhelmed if you're not careful. And even if you don't watch the news, everyone's stressed. So, yeah, it's a really necessary method as far as I can. Maybe in a similar vein, I think the two sort of styles of practice from the Nalanda tradition that you unpack in a really beautiful way are the aspects of role modeling and sublimation. These are sort of the second half of your book. And these are probably the practices that most people would not be as familiar with, right? So people might have seen these Tibetan paintings of these deities, these Buddha figures, and sort of, wow, that's beautiful, or maybe they look a bit terrifying, but not sure what's going on there. I was wondering if you could maybe just introduce how you sort of frame this, what role modeling really is, and how these tantric or embodied practices work that way. That makes sense.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I joke with Dr. Nita about, and, Dr. Nita Chinaksan,
Yeah.
Tibetan doctor who has a very strong grounding in the tantric, the spiritual dimension of embodied healing that we call tantra. That is, the third of the three great waves of Buddhist culture and civilization, and the least understood and the least known, and the one that most strikes us as most religious. It's the most symbolic, rich symbolism and rituals and things that we normally associate with religion, not with anything else.
Yeah.
And so that both Dr. Nita and I agree, and I don't know many other people who do. I haven't read your other teacher. Is it Bob Priest?
Rob Priest, yeah.
But most, Dr. Nita and I agree that Tantra is really like Western psychotherapy really is Tantric. And what do we mean by that? So Tantra often has a kind of a bit of a controversial name because it was initially confused with the Kama Sutra, with sort of some kind of sexual pleasure practice.
Right.
When in fact, working with sexual energy, love energy is only one dimension, and it's not really about sex per se. It's really about energy and learning how to cultivate more positive, what I call clean energy, right? That energy that it doesn't burn us with all the taints that our normal passions do. So in any case, what we mean, the essence of Tantra, according to the Tibetans, is not, the sex or working with desire. It's not all the fancy artwork that's associated or the rituals that are associated. It's not even another key part of the Tantras is the use of the Hatha Yoga central nervous system, right? The chakras, channels. None of those things are really the essence of the practice or the methodology. The essence of the methodology is modeling from another human with a more evolved nervous system, modeling one's own transformation of one's own nervous system in a way that accelerates, because actually we're wired as mammals to learn or grow through modeling, through imprinting and modeling. So it's essentially, just as in psychotherapy, the heart of the practice is this, what Jung and some of his followers called sort of an alchemy that gets sort of stimulated by the dynamic between the therapist and the client, with being in the presence of a truly loving, caring, safe, what I call a congenial relationship.
Mm,
Likewise, in the Tantra, the idea is that we're really using our fundamental learning system, which is about social learning from others, right, from
mm,
parents and other role models. We're using that to accelerate the evolution or transformation of our stress conditioned nervous system into not a survival based nervous system, but a thriving based nervous system. And we do
right.
that by identifying others who have that kind of nervous system and modeling, being around them or imagining being like them or being them
Hmm.
uh, in ways that just more quickly, intuitively inform us or transform us.
Mm,
And so, you know, that in a way you can really simplify that to say, what is a human being? It's a mind and a body, right? Or a mind, energy and body, if you want to be, a mind, spirit, and body, if you want to be fancy.
mm,
Um, and those two practices you mentioned, the role modeling imagery is a way of remodeling our default or survival based or traumatized concept or image of ourselves, our identity and narrative, um, based on uh, a more positive, chosen, consciously inspiring or uplifting or empowering image of who we want to be or who we really are in our true nature,
mm,
apart from all the stress, and learning how to model that with another supporting us in the same way we learn our identity in relationship in childhood or other relationships.
right.
So that's
Right.
mind, developing a mind using role modeling that is a chosen, thriving, highly confident and capable mind.
Mm,
Um, and then the body, in a sense, really has to do with both working with the energy, learning to transform energy in our way of being in our body, uh, using breath control and other
hmm.
things like body language.
Yeah.
Those two practices of role modeling and sublimation really are about transforming the mind, the energy, and the body at these deeper levels from survival mode into thrival. And so, in
Right.
that sense, it's a little bit more than just psychotherapy, right? And
Hmm.
this, since that Jung's approach to psychotherapy was it really was in a way a spiritual process of integration and
Yeah.
wholeness, and that it wasn't just an individual healing an illness. It's a psyche being more conscious, awakening, and integrating, and that also means a collective event. It's also an
Mm,
event ripples out through our relationships and our participation in culture
yeah.
to to have a whole very potentially very positive impact on our way of being in the world. So it's kind of like an accelerated version of the compassion training that
Yeah.
we first had, right. It's sort of souped up. It's a little more psychologically, goes to the heart or the subliminal energy centers and psychic patterns and speaks directly to them to shift out of stress and reactivity or trauma and shift into love, care, generativity, creativity.
Yeah. 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 Beautiful. And I think what's especially sort of radical about these role modeling practices is that while there initially is a kind of idealized, almost transference relationship with the mentor, you imagine this person in the form of this archetype. There's many of them out there. These ones you see in the images, but gradually that sort of idealized self-image gets internalized, right? Where eventually you imagine yourself as being that being and having all the capacities associated. You have all the wisdom and compassion and efficacy that you might require in the world, and to some extent even transforming your sense of what the world is, right? That actually the environment is a fully safe and abundant place. where all you're doing is just benefiting others from a place of abundance. So one metaphor I really liked from your book is that of the flight simulator, right? That
Mhm.
you have these sort of advanced training methods for soldiers and first responders where you're literally using the full imagination, kind of like VR, really in an embodied way, training the skills, which is, of course, much more integrated than just, okay, I have the compassionate intention, but I have no idea what it really feels like to be a fully capable sort of person. And here you're really doing that. So I really like that that part of your book as well. Um, yeah,
Yeah, the technology of the tantras is really quite remarkable.
yeah,
You alluded to the core of it, which is this sophisticated transference psychology, which, like, if you, I often refer to a phrase one of Jung's sort of distant followers, Heinz Kohut, talked about that is the essence of psychotherapy is what he called the transmuting internalization.
well,
And transmuting, for those of you who like recognize it, is it's a little buzzword from alchemy. It's about, like, just as alchemy changes, it's supposed to change base metal into gold. In other words, the basic, restructuring the material structure of an element.
yeah,
Uh, so to the process of taking in the experience of possibility that we have when we see somebody who we really admire, who can be in a way that we really would love to be.
mm,
Uh, when we take in that ideal into ourselves, into our nervous system, we internalize that ideal, and we see, well, maybe it's not so far out of my range or capacity. Maybe I could, learn to be that way, or maybe I am that way already. I just
hmm,
don't know.
yeah,
That has a way of transmuting our fundamental default setting. If our default setting is largely based on our clinging to a conditioned self-image that's mostly conditioned by trauma and stress, and
right,
the worst case fears that we have in our development, or in other difficult, important relationships. So,
hmm,
learning how to shift that self-image and our sense of ourselves sort of can help us get out of our own way and access this potential we don't think we have. So
mm,
that sort of notion of transmuting internalization I found super helpful, and is part of that.
yeah,
And of course the other one you mentioned of the sort of the flight simulator really speaks very much to the whole idea of plasticity, and how we become what we focus on, what we do, right?
mm,
So by practicing being the more empowered being, you know, we are we are giving we're accessing different parts of our potential or our genome. You know,
yeah,
we're at, we're wiring different neural networks, reinforcing uh, more thriving based neural networks,
yeah,
changing our history. We're really fundamentally transforming who we are. We're preparing to be. We're preparing our system to be what we admire.
right, right. Yeah, and I guess the changing the sort of chemistry that we run on is maybe the sort of the last phase of tantric practice, which is also shrouded in quite a bit of mystery and secrecy when it comes to these practices working with the subtle body, energy body. Various terms are used, you know, with the channels and the chakras and so forth. Um, I think you have a very unique perspective on this sort of map because while it's very common to kind of get into debates about, you know, do subtle energies really exist and that sort of thing, it's also possible to take this angle of maybe these are different maps coming from different perspectives. Like in a way, the neuroscientific map is the third person. If we're looking from outside, that's what we see. But if you look from the first person point of view, what does the nervous system feel like from the inside out, you could say. then it's quite remarkable that if you approach the subtle body in that way, then we don't have to sort of get bogged down in debates about metaphysics and ontology of, do these things exist? It's just it's a useful way of working with the felt nervous system, you might say, whatever it really is made of.
Exactly. I think it's so key that, I mean, Western science is so focused on having a kind of reductive, getting to the, what's the molecular basis of, and it's usually objectifying and externalizing
Yeah,
so I can manipulate it.
yeah,
But this Buddhist science is fundamentally committed to a phenomenological method
mm,
where it's more like, that does involve an experiment, right? Because
yeah,
it's empirical, because we're actually willing to test our experiential uh, shifts
yeah,
against, the intersubjective test of what are other people around us, how do they experience us, or
yeah,
is there a real impact in terms of outcome? Do we feel differently? Do we behave differently?
yeah,
So there's a kind of evidence base, or there's a kind of falsifiability involved in this methodology that makes it scientific.
right,
On the other hand, the phenomenological focus reads to us as completely unscientific,
yeah,
because we're so brainwashed that there's just this one kind of science which is only about things, and thinking of ourself as a thing,
mm,
and not using our first person embodied felt sense of knowing and working with. Um, so yeah, I think that having that, essentially that map of how we experience the energies in our body, the different affective energies, neural energies,
yeah,
perhaps they're related to circulatory and lymphatic and epigenetics and so on and so forth, but
yeah,
we're not we're not reducing them to that level.
mm,
uh, we're looking at them in terms of how can I feel in my body,
yeah,
and when I practice certain things with my body, whether it's
yeah,
breath work or movement or experiencing altered states of consciousness, um, alternate mind body states, like how does it allow me to increase my capacity to feel into and regulate my
right,
nervous, right? So I do believe that the subtle body, even though it's spread throughout the whole torso, uh, is actually a way of learning how to feel into and regulate the nervous system, the central nervous system, the
right,
brain. The brain doesn't have any uh, sensory affective, afferent
yeah,
sensor. We can't feel the brain. We
yeah,
can't feel the nervous system, but we
yeah,
can feel the organs that are involved in that and are totally constantly interconnected with brain function. And if we
right,
learn how to read those cues, and we learn how to work with, we know that breath is one of the most powerful mind altering substances, if you will,
yeah,
right? Different patterns of breathing evoke different autonomic neural activation states, different mood states, different chemical states. So
yeah,
by working with breath, we can essentially learn how to regulate our central nervous system in a very deep way. And if you're wondering if this is just talk, you look at some of the research that's been done on Tibetan yogis,
yeah,
like
especially the Tumo practice, I guess.
Tumo practice, the work Herb Benson did. I was actually in his lab when he was just analyzing that research, and
Oh, wow.
in and more recently, Koshevnikov has done a number of studies on this. Uh, you know, the, there's real powerful impacts on brainstem functions, on hypothalamic functions that these yogis can achieve.
Yeah,
So you mentioned Mathieu Ricard and the heart, the emotional shift, but that actually gets registered too in terms of shifts that are measurable on the EEG. And again, there are these deeper shifts that relate to metabolism, to neurochemistry, to And so we know that this stuff works.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it becomes a question of like, you know, uh, I mean, I believe that not too soon we'll have mapped out all the neural, you know, the reductive neural mechanisms and pathways of how all these practices work. But actually, that isn't
Yeah.
going to solve the problem, which is how do we actually make the transformation happen? And
Exactly.
that's where the phenomenological maps and tools are really primary. But
Yeah.
like we wouldn't have anything to measure if we didn't have the methodology of regulating and transforming
Yeah.
our nervous system. So that's why, even though they're kind of soft, it's a soft technology, it's actually very powerful and critical.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just quickly noticing the time. I don't know if you have to run in a minute, but maybe that's
Soon.
soon. Okay. Yeah. No, I just wanted to add one thing that I can say from experience, having dabbled a little bit in these sort of perfection stage practices like Tumo and vase breathing. It is quite remarkable how big the shifts can be. Even if you do it for 10 minutes, you feel extraordinarily different afterwards. And just the difference of going to a social event, normally might experience a social anxiety, and then doing a little bit of this sort of practice before and just being entirely relaxed. Quite, impossible to explain, but yeah, it's phenomenologically, it's very much true what you said. So,
And that's Buddhist
yeah,
science in a way, is that we don't worry, we don't wait for the statistics to come in,
yeah,
the data to come in from the machines, from the readouts.
yeah,
We actually do the experiment ourselves in our own minds and bodies, and then we experience the results. And
yeah,
again, like temporary shifts in mind body state are one kind of result. But supposing that we really can fundamentally transform a real sort of what seemed like a fixed problem, like social anxiety or like depression or whatever addiction.
yeah,
Supposing we can transform these, and the people around us can validate that, or behavior validates that, then there's a real science there, and
yeah,
we don't have to wait for all the data to come in. And even
yeah,
if we have all the data, it still wouldn't be the real experiment, which is, does this change me?
yeah,
Do these practices change me and my
yeah,
life?
yeah. Through the experiment, exactly. Um, Great. So, yeah, I'm also mindful of your time. So, yeah, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to mention?
I think we've covered it all, Timo.
Good, good. Wonderful. Yeah, so if people want to explore more about you and your work, where will be the best place for them to go?
To look at the Nalanda Institute website, that's NALANDA, nalandainstitute.org.
Great.
And
Yeah,
check out our programs, and we're always eager to meet new people and share this very rich tradition.
right. Wonderful. So it's
Okay.
been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, good luck with your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Important effort. Take care.
Thank you. See you. Bye bye.